So, wolves are pretty cool. One of the coolest things about the wolf is their famous howl. Wolves are not the only animals who howl, but there certainly is no other species that is as renowned for their howling as the wolf. They're definitely the most prolific howlers. For years, my favorite aspect of the howl, the thing that I thought was most cute and awesome about them, is that wolves close their eyes when they do it. I was about to write a post on Mastodon exalting this adorable habit of wolves when I realized, wait a minute, do wolves actually close their eyes when they howl, or does it only look that way? There's plenty of video footage which shows wolves wooing into the wilderness, but most of it doesn't really show their eyes. They tend to tilt their heads all the way back such that all we can see is their gaping mouth. Just like Peanuts characters when they sing. When Charlie Brown and his friends erupt into a joyful chorus, it's only their nose and mouth which are visible as they project skyward. And I was thinking, I don't know, maybe a wolf can't help but close their eyes when they howl? You know how you more or less have to close your eyes when you sneeze? That sort of thing. I just gotta make sure. So I watched a whole bunch of videos of howling wolves on YouTube to make sure. And the results were, honestly, kinda inconclusive. If you look closely, this individual is sorta opening and closing their eyes repeatedly. This Mexican gray lobo is clearly not closing their eyes at all. I also observed that whenever a wolf stops howling for a brief rest, they never keep their eyes closed. So watching all of these videos was a lot of fun. But then I thought to myself, this question has got to have already been answered. Time to do a little bit of proper research. So, I went to the place where I usually begin to research something, Wikipedia. Wikipedia can be a great place to get initially acquainted with a subject and point you in the direction of lots of sources to let you dig deeper. This video is really about why it's important to respect that. Wikipedia itself should never be your primary source for information. Let me tell you a little story about why that's true. The first place I looked was, naturally, the article called Howling. The article doesn't say anything one way or another about what wolves do with their eyes when they howl, but it does make a different and completely unexpected claim. Wolves from different geographic locations may howl in different fashions. The howls of European wolves are much more protracted and melodious than those of North American wolves, whose howls are louder and have a stronger emphasis on the first syllable. The two are, however, mutually intelligible, as North American wolves have been recorded to respond to European-style howls made by biologists. I completely abandoned my search about the eyes and pivoted to this detail here about mutual intelligibility. At first I was like, wait a minute, is this a typo? Is this just really bad grammar? And the article meant to say, biologists have recorded North American wolves responding to howls from European wolves. Because the way it's currently written, it makes it seem like a bunch of human biologists just started howling into the night, imitating the European wolves. But that can't be right? Maybe the Wikipedia article specifically about wolf communication has more accurate information. So I looked. But this article says exactly the same thing! This claim about mutual intelligibility and the insinuation that humans imitated wolves for science is quite literally copy-pasted. I'm not sure who copied who, but it doesn't matter, because at this stage, I didn't like what I was reading. Just on the face of it, it doesn't make any sense to me. First, a quick aside on what mutually intelligible even means. Linguists use this as a sort of test. If two people are making noises at one another and they are considering what the other one is saying and they're responding to each other, then they probably are speaking the same language. This is one reason how we know that American English and British English are both of the same language, even though the squeaks and squeals of an American sound different from those of an English person. So, with that in mind, how can we conclude that American wolves and European wolves howl in different but mutually intelligible dialects just because a bunch of non-wolves elicited a reaction from some actual wolves? Did the biologists actually understand what they were communicating, despite never having been taught by a wolf how to communicate? That's kind of an important aspect of mutual intelligibility as far as I'm aware. What if the wolves' response wasn't an indication that they understood the biologists, but rather because they were severely confused? Are humans in fact capable of convincing wolves that their own howls came from another wolf? It is orders of magnitude easier for me to buy the other claim, the simple statement that biologists have recorded American wolves having a back and forth with European wolves. That makes more sense to me on the surface. But that's not what the articles say. Fortunately, both articles cite their source so that I can get to the bottom of this. They refer to a 1981 book called The Wolf, His Place in the Natural World by Eric Ziman. Page 73, that's useful. It took me way too long to track down a copy of this book, partially because the entry for it on the Internet Archive has bad metadata. It says the book was written by Eric N., not Eric Ziman, but it's a lowercase n, which makes me think they only captured the last letter of Ziman's last name or something. Anyway, here's the book. Let's read it. And let's make sure to include a little bit of extra context, too. Dave invited me to accompany him on his work. We went to an already known rendezvous, an old clearing in the forest that had become thickly overgrown again, where, upon howling, we were immediately answered by about 5 cubs and an older animal. I climbed a tree to get a better view, and kept howling in my European wolf dialect, while the cubs responded in American. The howling of American wolves is in fact different from that of their European counterparts. I maintained that the howling of European wolves was more protracted and melodious, while that of the American wolves, perhaps because of stronger emphasis on the initial syllable, seemed rather louder. So far as the melodiousness of the howling was concerned, Dave and his colleagues naturally did not agree with me. So I sat in the tree and howled, while the others recorded the howling of the cubs on tape. The cubs, attracted by my howling, drew nearer and nearer, and eventually 5 of them, skinny little fellows about 4 months old, were sitting under my tree, and we went on howling at each other. Wow, okay, so yeah, it wasn't bad grammar after all. This guy literally did imitate a wolf's howl for science. Furthermore, the Wikipedia articles make a statement about the melodiousness of the howls as if it is established fact, but in the source they cite, Ziman's colleagues disagree with him. Here's the thing. It's not particularly good science, right? I'm not completely off base here, right? I mean, I came up with all those reasons earlier casting doubt on the mutual intelligibility thing. And that is because of one important factor which I haven't mentioned yet. The critical detail is that Ziman doesn't actually state that his howling, or the howling of any other human researchers, actually implied any sort of intelligibility at all. The human researchers, Ziman among them, are merely able to elicit reactions from the wolves, but he never suggests what these reactions really are, because the very purpose of howling is itself kind of a mystery. Ziman says just as much a few pages prior. We certainly have more data nowadays than Ziman had in 1981, but the point is that there's definitely something fishy about how the statement is written in the Wikipedia articles. Ziman never said anything about mutual intelligibility, as such. And it gets extra tenuous when we zoom out further to get even more context. It's important to consider that Ziman was operating at a time before the theories surrounding dominance hierarchies had been fully sorted out. You might already be familiar with the story that the whole idea of fighting for rank and maintaining a hierarchical order within a pack the whole alpha male and alpha female thing, that's been thoroughly debunked. And you might also be familiar with the story that it was debunked by the guy who initially put it forth. Just in case you didn't know, and also to set the record straight, the biologist David Meech wrote a book in 1970 called The Wolf, The Ecology and Behavior of an Endangered Species. There's a chapter in it about pack order, where he heavily relies on a study of wolf behavior by Rudolf Schenkel, which was the best research available to Meech at the time. The problem, according to Meech, is that he wanted to study wolves and he kind of knew that wolves lived in a pack, but he had no idea what a pack was. Turns out a pack is really just a family. Meanwhile, Schenkel's wolves were kept in captivity and were not related to one another. An article in the New Yorker suggests that this might be the equivalent of studying the human family by observing the culture of prisoners in a holding cell. It's just completely wrong. David Meech did not introduce the idea of alpha males and so forth, but he did write the best-selling book that was read by scientists and non-scientists alike. He thus popularized the bogus ideas. Despite knowing for absolute certain his book was wrong since at least 1999, thanks to newer and better research, and despite wanting to yank it off store shelves, the book was not rescinded by the publisher until 2022. Tying this back to Eric Zeiman and the Wikipedia articles, remember how Dave invited him to accompany him on his work? That's David Meech. That's the guy. That's the guy who wrote the book with all the incorrect stuff in it. So what? Well, what I'm trying to say is that even though Zeiman was out in the field conducting his own studies, he was still influenced by the prevailing yet faulty ideas of the time. It is true that Zeiman does ask some extremely good questions about the whole rank thing. Would it not be much better to live in a completely egalitarian group in which there were no differences in rank? Doesn't the existence of such differences actually encourage aggression? Those are good questions. But he does not completely reject the notion of Schenkel's dominance hierarchies. Thus, we need to be just as careful when citing Zeiman as we need to be when we cite David Meech. When you and I want to research wolf behavior today, we must not fall into the same trap that Meech did, prematurely making conclusions based on just a small number of observations, the wrong kinds of observations. To wrap up, let's take a look at the controversial statement again. It is my informed and considered opinion that this is an overstatement. It is true that North American wolves have been recorded on tape to respond to European-style howls made by biologists. But to go any further and surmise that this implies mutual intelligibility between the two, that is editorializing. So what? Well, it's really interesting to see how a fact, complete with a citation, can still be not fully true. We've seen that our little factoid has been copy-pasted in multiple places already. When this sort of copy-pasting goes unchecked, that's how misinformation is born. And that's our lesson for today. I'm sure most of you out there are excellent writers who validate their sources and actually do the research, but I think it helps to take a step back and really consider what's at stake when we don't do our due diligence.